Here's something most analysts won't tell you. Russia isn't just fighting for territory in Ukraine, they're dismantling a weapon system that was specifically designed to destroy them. And until that system is completely neutralized, there can be no peace agreement. None. This isn't about pride or imperial ambition, it's about survival. The West built what military strategists call a fortress belt across Ukraine, a sophisticated network of NATO-grade fortifications, command centers, intelligence hubs, and weapons depots that stretch from Kharkiv to Odessa. These aren't just defensive positions, they were designed as launch platforms for offensive operations deep into Russian territory. Moscow watched this infrastructure being assembled for years, even as Western diplomats promised NATO expansion was off the table. Now, Russia faces an existential calculation: sign a ceasefire that leaves this fortress intact, or eliminate the threat permanently. From Moscow's perspective, any peace deal that preserves Ukraine's offensive capabilities simply gives the West time to rearm, regroup, and restart the conflict on more favorable terms. They've seen this movie before, in Minsk I, Minsk II, and every other broken agreement over the past decade. That's why Russia's actual war aims have nothing to do with the fantasies you hear in mainstream coverage. They're methodically destroying the infrastructure that made Ukraine a forward operating base against them. Until that mission is complete, peace talks are just theater. Now let me explain exactly what this fortress belt actually is and why it matters so much that Russia would rather fight for years than leave it standing. When Western media talks about Ukraine, they show you destroyed buildings and heroic resistance, but they never show you the maps. They never show you the infrastructure that was built over the past decade with billions of dollars in NATO funding. This wasn't charity. This was military engineering on a scale most people can't even comprehend. Ukraine wasn't just receiving weapons shipments. The entire country was being transformed into a massive military installation pointed directly at Russia's heartland. Think about what happened after 2014. The moment the pro-Russian government fell in Kiev, Western military advisors flooded into the country. But they weren't just training troops. They were building an entire command and control architecture from scratch. We're talking about hardened bunkers that can survive tactical nuclear strikes. We're talking about ammunition depots built into former Soviet mine complexes hundreds of feet underground. We're talking about surveillance systems that could track Russian military movements in real time and feed that data directly to NATO headquarters in Brussels. This was systematic, this was planned, and this was exactly what Russia said would be unacceptable. The fortress belt runs roughly along the line of contact that existed before this conflict went hot. It stretches from Kharkiv in the northeast all the way down through Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and into the southern regions approaching Odessa. Each major city in this belt was reinforced over years with layered defenses. The Ukrainians didn't just dig trenches, they built multi-level defensive networks with interconnected tunnels, reinforced firing positions, and logistics hubs that could sustain operations even if supply lines were cut. Some of these fortifications make World War II defensive lines look primitive by comparison. The amount of concrete poured into eastern Ukraine over the past decade could probably build a dozen major cities. But here's what makes this different from traditional defensive fortifications. This belt wasn't designed just to repel an invasion, it was designed to serve as a springboard for offensive operations. Look at the positioning of the forward bases. Look at where the artillery parks were located. Look at where they stockpiled the long-range missile systems. Everything was oriented not for defense of Ukrainian territory, but for strikes deep into Russia proper. The systems deployed in Kharkiv could hit targets 400 miles inside Russia. The installations near Donetsk were positioned to threaten Russia's southern military districts. This wasn't defensive posturing. This was preparation for a first strike capability. Now Moscow watched all of this happening and repeatedly said, this is a red line. They said it in 2014. They said it in 2015. They said it every single year after that. But the construction continued. The weapons flowed. The advisors kept coming. And every time Russia raised concerns, Western diplomats would say, we're not threatening you, this is just helping Ukraine defend itself. But at some point, when you've built offensive capabilities aimed at someone's throat, claiming those capabilities are defensive becomes an absurdity. It's like parking a loaded gun on your neighbor's property aimed at his bedroom window and insisting you're just exercising your right to property protection. The strategic logic here is actually very simple once you strip away the propaganda. Russia looks at that fortress belt and sees a dagger pointed at Moscow. Not metaphorically, literally. The flight time for certain missiles launched from Ukrainian territory to reach critical Russian command centers is measured in minutes. That's not enough time to respond. That's not enough time to make decisions. That's barely enough time to know you're under attack. In nuclear strategy, this is called a decapitation strike capability. You take out the leadership and command structure before they can respond, and suddenly you've neutralized a nuclear power's ability to retaliate. That sounds insane until you realize that this is exactly the kind of capability NATO has spent 30 years developing and deploying closer and closer to Russian borders. So when Russia launched its military operation, the primary objective wasn't capturing cities for territorial gain, it was destroying this infrastructure, systematically, methodically, taking apart the fortress belt piece by piece. That's why the conflict has moved the way it has. Russia isn't trying to conquer Ukraine in the classic sense. They're demilitarizing specific regions, they're eliminating weapons depots, they're taking out command centers, they're destroying the surveillance networks, and they're doing all of this knowing that every single installation they leave intact becomes a future threat to their existence. This is where peace negotiations get complicated. Western mediators keep proposing ceasefires that would freeze the conflict along current lines. Sounds reasonable on the surface. But look at what that actually means in practice. It means leaving significant portions of the fortress belt intact. It means Ukraine gets to keep the installations that Russia sees as existential threats. And more importantly, it means giving the West time to rebuild, rearm, and reinforce those positions. Remember, this is exactly what happened after Minsk I and Minsk II. Both agreements were supposed to bring peace. Both times the fighting stopped temporarily, and both times Ukraine and NATO used the breathing room to build more fortifications and bring in more weapons. Angela Merkel actually admitted this in an interview. She said the Minsk agreements were designed to give Ukraine time to build up its military. She said it out loud. The agreements weren't meant to achieve peace. They were tactical pauses designed to advantage one side. Now you're Russia, and you've just heard the former German Chancellor admit that the last two peace agreements were deceptions meant to help your adversary prepare for war against you. How likely are you to trust the next peace proposal? How likely are you to agree to a ceasefire that leaves your enemy's offensive infrastructure intact? This is the fundamental disconnect in all the current peace talk rhetoric. Western leaders keep saying Russia just needs to withdraw and negotiate. But from Moscow's perspective, negotiating while the fortress belt remains operational is like negotiating while someone holds a gun to your head. The gun has to be removed first. The threat has to be neutralized. Only then can you have meaningful discussions about political settlements, borders, and governance. This isn't Russian aggression, this is Russia insisting on basic security guarantees that any nuclear power would demand in similar circumstances. Look at how America responds to perceived threats near its borders. The Cuban Missile Crisis nearly triggered nuclear war because the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba. Those missiles were defensive according to Moscow. They were there to protect Cuba from American invasion, which was a legitimate concern after the Bay of Pigs. But Washington didn't care about Moscow's rationale. They demanded the missiles be removed immediately. They imposed a naval blockade. They put nuclear forces on high alert. And they made absolutely clear that Soviet missiles 90 miles from Florida were unacceptable regardless of the justification. That crisis ended only when the missiles were withdrawn, not when both sides agreed to respect each other's security concerns, not when diplomats drafted elegant language about mutual understanding. The crisis ended when the physical threat was eliminated. Russia is applying the exact same logic to Ukraine. The fortress belt is their Cuban Missile Crisis, except it's been building for a decade rather than appearing overnight. And unlike Kennedy, who had the option of a naval blockade, Russia's only option was direct military action to dismantle the threat. They tried diplomacy for 8 years. They proposed treaty after treaty. They offered compromise after compromise. Every proposal was rejected, every concern was dismissed, and the fortress belt kept growing. Now we're in a situation where Russia has committed to eliminating this infrastructure regardless of the cost. They've mobilized their economy, they've sustained hundreds of thousands of casualties, they've endured the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history, they've been cut off from Western financial systems, they've watched their foreign reserves get frozen, they've seen their companies nationalized, they've been subjected to a propaganda campaign that portrays them as the new Nazi Germany, and through all of that, they've continued grinding forward, taking apart the fortress belt piece by piece. This tells you something crucial about Russian calculations. They've decided this is an existential fight. They're not doing cost-benefit analysis, like a corporation deciding whether to enter a new market. They're operating on the logic of survival, and when a nuclear power decides something is existential, they don't compromise. They don't settle for partial solutions. They see it through to the end because anything less means accepting a permanent threat to their existence. Western analysts keep predicting that Russia will run out of steam. They'll run out of weapons, they'll run out of money, they'll run out of soldiers, the Russian economy will collapse. Putin will be overthrown. We've heard all these predictions for over 2 years now. None of them have materialized. Why? Because Russia isn't fighting a war of choice. They're fighting what they perceive as a war of survival. And countries fighting for survival find resources they didn't know they had. They endure hardships that outside observers think are impossible. They sustain campaigns that drain their treasuries and their populations because the alternative is accepting defeat in a fight they believe determines their future existence. This is also why economic sanctions haven't changed Russian behavior. The Western strategy was to inflict so much economic pain that Moscow would be forced to back down. But that strategy only works if the target sees the conflict as discretionary. If you're fighting for something peripheral to your interests, yeah, maybe economic pressure changes your calculus. But if you're fighting for what you define as survival, economic sanctions just become another hardship to endure. Russians have experienced economic hardship before. They lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union. They lived through the chaos of the 1990s. They remember what real economic catastrophe looks like. The current sanctions are difficult, but they're not existential in the way that accepting a permanent NATO military infrastructure in Ukraine would be existential. So where does this leave us? We're in a grinding attritional conflict where one side has decided it will accept nothing less than complete elimination of the infrastructure it defines as threatening. Russia will demilitarize those regions. They will destroy the fortress belt. They will eliminate Ukraine's ability to serve as a NATO forward operating base, and they will do this regardless of how long it takes or what it costs. That's not a prediction. That's just reading their actions and taking their statements seriously rather than dismissing them as propaganda. The tragedy here is that this outcome was entirely preventable. If NATO had honored its post-Cold War commitments not to expand eastward, none of this would have happened. If Western powers had implemented the Minsk agreements in good faith, none of this would have happened. If anyone had taken Russian security concerns seriously, instead of dismissing them as the whining of a declining power, we could have found diplomatic solutions. But at every turn, Russia's concerns were treated as illegitimate. Their requests for security guarantees were mocked. Their proposals for treaty frameworks were ignored. And all the while, the fortress belt kept growing. Now we're living with the consequences. Ukraine is being destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Millions are displaced. The global economy has been disrupted. Energy markets are in chaos. Food supplies are threatened. And we're closer to nuclear confrontation than at any point since the Cold War. All of this to preserve NATO's ability to expand its military infrastructure right up to Russia's borders. Was it worth it? That's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer honestly. Because if you look at this from a purely strategic perspective, divorced from the moral narratives and the propaganda, what exactly has the West gained? They've pushed Russia into a closer partnership with China. They've accelerated the formation of alternative economic and financial systems that bypass Western control. They've demonstrated that Western security guarantees are worthless, which has convinced countries from Saudi Arabia to India that they need to diversify their relationships. They've shown the developing world that the rules-based international order only applies when it suits Western interests. They've depleted their own weapons stockpiles to the point where military readiness is compromised, and they've achieved none of their stated objectives in Ukraine. The fortress belt that was supposed to contain Russia is being systematically destroyed. Ukraine's military is being ground down despite massive Western support. The sanctions that were supposed to cripple Russia have instead accelerated economic diversification and strengthened ties with the global majority. And the information war that was supposed to isolate Russia internationally has largely failed outside the Western bubble. Most of the world has refused to join the sanctions regime. Most of the world continues doing business with Russia. Most of the world sees this conflict not as good versus evil, but as a proxy war between great powers, with Ukraine caught in the middle. So, when Russia says they won't agree to peace without elimination of the fortress belt, they're not being unreasonable by the standards of great power politics. They're insisting on the same security guarantees that any major power would demand. The difference is they have the military capacity to enforce those demands, and they've demonstrated the willingness to pay the price for doing so. That's not a moral judgment. That's just strategic reality. Russia has decided this is their line. They're not moving. And short of direct NATO military intervention, which would risk nuclear war, There's no forcing them to accept a settlement that leaves the infrastructure they define as threatening. This means the conflict continues until one of two things happens. Either Russia completes its objective of dismantling the fortress belt, or NATO decides that propping up Ukraine isn't worth the cost and forces Kiev to accept Moscow's terms. There's no third option where Russia suddenly decides to trust Western security guarantees and agree to a ceasefire that leaves its concerns unaddressed. That ship sailed years ago, probably around the time Angela Merkel admitted the Minsk agreements were tactical deceptions. What we're watching now is the slow-motion collapse of the post-Cold War security architecture. The idea that NATO could expand indefinitely without consequences has been proven false. The belief that economic sanctions could force major powers to back down has been demonstrated to have serious limitations. The assumption that military aid could allow a proxy force to defeat a nuclear-armed great power on its own border has turned out to be fantasy. All the pillars of Western strategy over the past 30 years are crumbling, and there's no clear vision for what comes next. That's the real story behind Russia's refusal to negotiate without elimination of the fortress belt. It's not about Putin's ego or imperial ambitions or any of the personality-driven narratives you hear in mainstream coverage. It's about a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. It's about one major power deciding it will no longer accept security arrangements that it sees as existentially threatening, and having the capacity to enforce that decision through military action. Everything else is just details. The fortress belt will be eliminated. The only question is how much destruction happens before we acknowledge that reality and start building a security architecture that actually addresses the concerns of all parties rather than just imposing terms on the losing side.